Hello, and welcome to another episode of It's a History podcast. I am your host, Madison, and this week we'll be looking into the life and legacy of Margaret Sanger. Margaret is most notably known for founding the birth control movement, as well as spearheading the efforts that resulted in the modern-day birth control pill in the 1960s. Born in 1879, Margaret was the sixth of 11 children born to Michael Hennessy Higgins and Anne Purcell Higgins in Corny, New York. Her mother died at only 50 years old, which Margaret largely attributed to the toll of her many pregnancies on her body. Margaret would carry this sentiment along with her for the rest of her life. In 1896, Margaret became a nurse after attending the Claverack College in Hudson River, New York. She would go on to marry William Sanger in 1902, just as she was finishing up her final year of her nursing program at White Plains Hospital. They would live in Hastings, New York until the family moved to New York City in 1910 with their 3 children after a fire destroyed the family home. The couple soon became involved with many of the Progressive Era activists and intellectuals. This was the time of Upton Sinclair and Max Eastman. If you wanted to be involved in a social program, New York was teeming with individuals wanting to make change. Margaret's work as a nurse in New York would light the fire in her to set off on her mission to protect women from the same fate as her mother with knowledge and practices that would allow them to make decisions that were right for them and their families. Margaret soon became involved with the Women's Committee of the New York chapter of the Socialist Party, as well as participating in women's labor protests during this time. As Margaret's work as a nurse transitioned out of the hospital and into people's homes, she worked as a traveling nurse largely within poor areas. She would often find herself in the homes of poor women who had immigrated to the U.S. with large families. She would note the poor health of many of these women had due to their many pregnancies, miscarriages, and in some cases even back alley abortions. During this time, she wrote 2 series of columns on sex education for the New York Call, a socialist magazine. The first column was published from 1911 to 1912 and was titled What Every Mother Should Know. The follow-up column in 1912 to 1913 was called What Every Girl Should Know. She also published Family Limitations from 1911 to 1920, which contained details and precise information as well as graphic descriptions of various contraceptive methods in its 16 pages. In 1914, Margaret would launch her own feminist publication, The Woman Rebel, in which she advocated for birth control. This would also start her long battle with the Comstock laws. What are the Comstock laws, you ask? Well, it was a law that prohibited the distribution of lewd and obscene materials through the mail, and during this time, information on birth control and family planning were considered obscene. Soon after the release of her publication, Margaret was charged with violating the Comstock law. Like any good criminal, Margaret fled to England. Back home, she had friends continue to share her pamphlets while she was gone. After a year on the lam, she returned to stand trial, but due to public pressure after the recent sudden death of her 5-year-old daughter, the charges were eventually dropped. During this time, she divorced from her husband. She would later marry an oil tycoon named James Noah Slow in 1922. In the meantime, her now estranged husband would actually give a copy of Family Limitations to a representative of Anthony Comstock, of Comstock law fame. He later spent 30 days in jail. Soon after her ordeal with the law, she opened the first birth control clinic in Brownsville, Brooklyn in 1916. If the spreading of pamphlets led to being charged, it would be no surprise that within a week of opening the clinic, Margaret was arrested and would spend 30 days in jail. Any publicity is good publicity, and this was definitely the case for Margaret and her birth control clinic. After her arrest, word began to spread around about her clinic, and she gained support of several affluent supporters. Shortly after, in 1917, Margaret launched the Birth Control Federation, and she would later found the American Birth Control League in 1921 to gain support from social workers, medical professionals, and the public for birth control. The principles of the American Birth Control League were as follows. We hold that children should be first conceived in love, second, born of the mother's conscious desire, and third, and only begotten under conditions which render possible the heritage of health. Therefore, we hold that every woman must possess the power and freedom to prevent conception except when these conditions can be satisfied. The League promoted the founding of birth control clinics and encouraged women to control their own fertility. Margaret would appeal her conviction, but would lose. This did eventually lead to the court's ruling that physicians could prescribe contraceptives to women for medical reasons. This ruling would allow Margaret to open another clinic in 1923 that was staffed by female doctors and social workers. This building would eventually become the first Planned Parenthood Federation of America and quickly grew into the leading contraceptive research center of the world. In 1929, she formed the National Committee on Federal Legislation so that she could lobby Congress for legislation that would allow doctors to prescribe birth control regardless of medical need. Margaret faced resistance resistance and backlash from doctors as well as the Catholic Church. Despite the pushback she received, Margaret's activism and hard work led to the legalization and widespread usage of contraceptives in the U.S. In 1936, the courts finally made it legal for doctors to prescribe birth control. Margaret did not stop there. In the 1950s, with funds from heiress Catherine McCormick, she recruited researcher Gregory Pincus to develop an oral contraceptive. The pill was eventually approved by the FDA in 1960. In 1965, the Supreme Court case Griswold v. Connecticut, the court ruled that the use of contraceptives was a constitutional right. Margaret's second husband would also be involved in her activism, much like her first husband, William. As a man of means, James would actually smuggle diaphragms to Canada and would eventually become the first legal manufacturer of diaphragms in the U.S. Unfortunately, with figures from the past, they will oftentimes have associations that taint their reputation. For Margaret, it was her involvement with the eugenics movement. Eugenics was a belief surrounding the breeding out of undesirable populations by limiting their ability to procreate, whether it was through birth control or sterilizing, often involuntary. Margaret was involved in the sense that birth control could limit birth defects, which is something that people still do today by getting screened for genetic diseases. Even though Margaret herself claimed that she did not believe in all aspects of the eugenics movement's reputation for being for the selectiveness in breeding out certain races and classes of people has tainted her reputation so much so that her name has been removed from the Planned Parenthood building in New York. Margaret could have advocated for limiting birth defects as well as family planning or within the confines of her already existing organizations, but she chose to associate herself with the eugenics movement. She seemed to be able to look past the forced sterilizations and blatant racism the movement partook in. During this time, there was also a focus on population growth. There was worry that the population was growing too quickly, and the best way to stop this was to provide birth control and family planning, primarily to those considered less than. This is highlighted in the birth control pill trials that were performed in Puerto Rico, one of the more densely populated areas. When conducting these trials, Gregory Pincus did not inform these women taking the pills that it was still in the trial period, just that it would prevent pregnancy. Women were not informed of the possible side effects, even dangerous side effects, or that the pill itself was completely experimental. The story itself deserves its own episode, so I won't go into it too much here, but the effects of this trial and population control movement are still seen on the island. Puerto Rico currently has a birth rate of less than 1. For normal population replacement rates, the birth rate needs to be 2.1. I'm going to stop myself before I get too ahead. This was actually the topic I wrote about for my senior seminar class in college on the American Empire, which itself is another rabbit hole of information. Margaret was also opposed to abortions, having seen the effects of back alley abortions on her patients. She was largely for stopping the pregnancy from happening in the first place with the use of birth control. I think it would be safe to say that no one ever wants to get an abortion, but that doesn't mean that we should not have access to abortions. To wrap this one up, I have a fun fact that the term birth control was coined by a friend of Margaret's, Otto Bobsty. While Margaret Sanger herself would have some poor associations and less than progressive ideas about abortion, it was with her determination that gave us one of the most effective ways of preventing pregnancy. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Hope to see you in the next one.